Banjo and Kazooie have both been through a lot since they first appeared on the Nintendo 64 all those years ago. They were bought by Microsoft, appeared in a racing game, starred in not Banjo 3E, cameoed in a Sonic game, and perhaps most importantly, somehow made the cut in freaking Super Smash Bros. Ultimate as one of a handful of guest fighters. Not bad for a humble bear and obnoxious bird. And now, nearly 25 years since their journey began, it's finally come full circle as the original game returns to a Nintendo platform for the first time ever, with Banjo-Kazooie being added to the Nintendo Switch Online Expansion Pack as a free perk. But does this aging 3D platformer hold up after all this time? And is it worth revisiting for fans who grew up with it in the first place, or even those experiencing it for the first time? Well, I recently revisited the game to find out, on both the original Nintendo 64 hardware, as well as the modestly upgraded Xbox versions. And I'm not gonna waste your time. The answer is probably yes to all of those questions, at least if you're a fan of collectathons or 3D platformers. And it's all thanks to a game that's endlessly charming and bursting at the seams with creative challenges, fun characters, and a brilliant presentation that still brings joy to this day, even if the game obviously can't impress graphically like it once did. From the very moment that the game opens with a musical number befitting its instrument-based origins, it's clear that you're in for something special. And that level of personality permeates the entire experience from start to finish, which includes an eclectic cast of wacky characters, a goofy sense of humor, and the fact that nearly every single person or thing that you meet in this game talks. Though not with words, mind you, but through a unique series of repeating sounds, like a snapping piranha, or an awfully squishy sounding orange. I may not have ever wondered what a talking bucket might sound like, and yet I can't imagine it as being anything other than this now. The sound design across the entire game is simply perfect. Not only does every one of the game's levels have a completely unique music track, but it even dynamically changes to match the different areas within. Mumbo's Mountain alone has 5 different versions, including underwater, that of termites singing along with Near Their Hive, or the very fitting addition of drums in Near Conga the Ape. It helps keep you engaged and immersed, while also preventing the music from ever sounding repetitive. Which helps because you'll likely be spending a fair amount of time in each of these levels, generally 30 to 60 minutes for returning players, and likely several hours for those new to the game. The worlds are just large enough that exploration feels satisfying without feeling overwhelming, which is a problem that even later rare games suffered from, including Banjo's very own sequel. Every corner of this world feels built with a purpose, and you'll never find a shortage of things to do. In just Freezezy Peak alone, you'll climb a giant snowman, play whack-a-mole against Christmas light-eating goblins, recover presents for 3 orphans, and sled race against a deadbeat polar dad. As a walrus? Oh right, did I even mention that you can shapeshift thanks to a local shaman? And it completely changes your movement and abilities. Whether it's climbing steep slopes as a termite, crossing dangerous waters as a crocodile, or spelunking as a pumpkin? Don't ask. These forms are an enjoyable change of pace, though they're rarely used for long, which is probably a good thing given how limited most of their abilities are. The walrus, for example, mostly exists to act as a key that triggers a couple of special events. One element that I love though is the out-of-the-box puzzle solving you may stumble upon when leaving a level while still in creature form, which allows you to explore Gruntilda's castle with your temporary shaman-given abilities. Beyond the transformations, Banjo-Kazooie even incorporates some light Metroidvania elements, as you'll discover new permanent abilities throughout the adventure, such as the power of flight or invincibility, allowing you to access new areas or perform tasks that you couldn't before. It provides a nice but somewhat optional gameplay loop of seeking out new abilities and being rewarded with more gameplay. Despite this, the game rarely requires much in the way of backtracking, especially if you play efficiently, because outside of a handful of instances, you can find most powers in the very same level that you'll first need them. Although in hindsight, it was a little odd to learn the spring jump in the same level as a flying ability, given that the spring jump felt immediately eclipsed. Whatever. But for as tightly designed as these levels can be, there are still moments that can frustrate, like having to trek through an annoying maze in Bubble Gloop Swamp anytime you want to transform, or trying to keep track of which of the nearly identical tunnels you've already explored in Clanker's Cavern. And then, of course, there's the infamous Rusty Bucket Bay, which is home to some of the game's most rage-inducing moments, including navigating precarious platforms in the bowels of a ship. Of course, 3D platformers often go by another, more disparaging title, Collectathon, which describes a game that's bogged down by collectible objects. Now, even though Banjo-Kazooie could possibly be considered one of the originators of that trend with its 3 different types of collectibles, 4 if you count the moves you can learn, I feel like it strikes a delicate balance that adds more than it takes away, with each collectible feeling rewarding to find rather than being tedious. For the most part. It probably helps that only 2 of those, being puzzle pieces and notes, are actually required to finish the game, with Mumbo tokens only being necessary for the largely optional transformations, assuming you're not trying to 100% the game. That being said, there is one possible exception to note, being the notes. And that's because the notes were originally treated as more of a high score, with you only keeping the ones for any particular level that you collected in a single run. Meaning, if you left and re-entered the stage, the notes would reset and you'd have to recollect them all again if you wanted to best your previous score. The Xbox version thankfully addressed this by treating them as a permanent collectible, so that any notes that you collect, you'll keep forever. And this is a notable advantage over the Nintendo 64 and Switch versions of the game, which both use the original system. Visually, despite being several console generations old, Banjo-Kazooie has aged remarkably gracefully. The character models, though obviously low polygon, have an endearing look to them that's aided by some impressively fluid animation. And the texture work is among the best of any game of its generation, featuring large texture maps that pop with color and detail, and avoids the ugly repeated texture look of other 3D platformers of the era. One of my favorite graphical touches is how the edge of each world seamlessly vanishes into the background, which makes the worlds feel almost endless. Another part of Banjo-Kazooie that stands out is the omnipresence of the game's villain, Gruntilda. Not only is the entire castle hub a monument to her narcissism with constant visual reminders of whose castle it really is, but she's constantly chiming in with ridiculous riddles and rhymes, which always make me giggle and shine. Hey, I tried. But I truly can't stress how satisfying it is that literally every single thing she says rhymes. Even Shakespeare would be proud. It apparently took so much effort that this character trait was sadly dropped in the sequel. Her constant presence adds a layer of depth that brings the adventure to life in a way no 3D platformer had before, and possibly since too. Which becomes especially obvious when approaching the end game, as Banjo-Kazooie has one of my favorite penultimate final challenges of any game ever, though I'm not going to ruin the surprise for anyone who hasn't played it yet. And speaking of which, it all adds up to make for a final battle that feels more earned than most. It's tough, but still satisfying when you finally knock that witch out. Despite releasing just 2 years after Super Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie darn near perfected the 3D platforming formula, offering denser worlds, better characters and story, and more cohesive world building, all of which is a feat that might be even more impressive in hindsight. Especially when you consider that it took nearly 2 decades for Mario to catch up with Mario Odyssey, which borrowed several elements from Banjo-Kazooie. One of the only areas where Banjo-Kazooie noticeably falters by comparison is the handling. Which isn't to say it's bad, because it isn't by any stretch. In fact, the game feels great to play. But, unlike say any of the 3D Mario games where it's a joy simply to move and bounce around, Banjo and Kazooie feel oddly pedestrian by comparison, with a more limited moveset that doesn't feel inherently fun to play, especially since it prevents the death-defying improv that Mario is famous for. But when everything else is as good as it is in Banjo-Kazooie, that one shortcoming is pretty easy to overlook. In short, Banjo-Kazooie absolutely stands the test of time, feeling almost as inventive today as it did a quarter century ago. Whew, where's the time go? The overall charm and cute sense of humor, though inarguably juvenile at times, will likely win you over in short order, and then you'll be hooked on seeing what crazy challenge awaits you next. And I absolutely loved all of it, even on my 1000th playthrough. So regardless of whether you're playing on Nintendo Switch, Xbox, or even an original Nintendo 64, you absolutely owe it to yourself to check out Banjo-Kazooie if you're at all a fan of 3D platformers, and especially if you enjoyed Super Mario Odyssey, because outside of Mario, they don't get much better than this. And with that, thank you so much for watching GameXplain's retro review of Banjo-Kazooie. If you enjoyed it, make sure to click that subscribe button and ring that bell for everything else Nintendo Switch. With that, we'll catch you later. Bye everyone!